The street is eerily silent, bathed in the cold, fading light of the setting sun. The buildings, old and weathered, stand like silent witnesses to years of oppression. The wind whispers through the trees, carrying with it a sense of unease. The clock strikes 8 p.m., the distant sound echoing down the empty street. A black man, the protagonist, walks slowly but purposefully. His steps are steady, but the tension in the air is palpable. He glances at the horizon, aware of the curfew, the invisible line drawn in the sand by the oppressive laws of the town. Every shadow seems deeper, every corner more dangerous. His heart beats a little faster as the streets grow quieter and the weight of the law presses down on him. As he walks, the audience feels the suffocating sense of danger. The protagonist is determined, but his determination is laced with fear. There's an unspoken rule, black after dark, and everyone knows the consequences. His path home is a tightrope walk between survival and defiance. A figure steps out from the shadows, their voice low and filled with a mix of warning and fear. You know the rules, don't you? Black after dark? That's a death sentence. The protagonist's footsteps echo through the empty street, his shadow stretching long behind him as the faint sound of distant sirens hums in the background. Just as he nears the corner to his home, a bright, blinding light hits him. His heart races, and a cold sweat breaks out on his neck. The sound of tires screeching fills the air as a police car pulls up in front of him, blocking his path. The doors open, and a group of white police officers step out, their faces hardened, eyes scanning him with suspicion. The protagonist freezes, his breath caught in his throat. The harsh glow of the police car's headlights casts long shadows over the scene, amplifying the fear that rises within him. He stands still, trying to steady his breathing, knowing that any wrong move could be fatal. Fear grips the protagonist, but there's also a flicker of defiance. His palms sweat, and his mind races, torn between staying calm and the overwhelming urge to run. His heartbeat pounds in his chest, but he keeps his posture firm. His mind races. What will happen if I don't comply? What will happen if I fight back? The uncertainty makes him feel powerless, yet a burning determination stirs within him. One of the officers steps forward, a sneer curling on his lips as he looks the protagonist up and down. The words come out sharp, laced with hostility. "What do you think you're doing out here after dark, boy?" The officer's voice is full of disdain, the word boy dripping with racial undertones, reminding the protagonist of his place in a world that sees him as nothing more than a threat. The protagonist stands tall, his voice steady, though his insides churn with fear. "I'm going home, like anyone else would be." The officers exchange a look, one of them smirking before they step closer, crowding him, trying to intimidate him. They remind him of the curfew, their words sharp and filled with authority, but the protagonist's heart pounds louder as he begins to realize this isn't just a routine stop, it's a trap, a reminder of how the system has always worked against him. The air is thick with tension as the officers close in on the protagonist. He can feel the weight of their hands grabbing his arms, their fingers pressing harshly against his skin. His heart races, his breath quickens. He knows what's coming next. He tries to stay calm, to keep his hands at his sides, but as he speaks, his voice trembles, the fear escaping despite his best efforts. "I'm just trying to get home," he says, his words almost pleading, but the officers have no interest in listening. Without warning, one officer grabs him roughly by the wrist, twisting it behind his back. The sound of bones cracking in protest sends a sharp wave of pain through his body. He gasps, but doesn't cry out. He's been taught that showing weakness could be dangerous. The harsh sound of cuffs snapping around his wrists cuts through the air, a final, undeniable symbol of his helplessness. The protagonist is roughly shoved toward the police van, the metal doors clanging shut behind him with a deafening finality. The protagonist's world spins in a whirlwind of fear, anger, and disbelief. His body is slammed against the cold metal of the van, and every moment feels like a crushing blow to his dignity. He can feel the weight of the officers' glares, the way they treat him like an animal rather than a man. His mind races, he knows what's coming. The fear of the unknown, of what will happen when he enters the system, begins to settle in like a cold, suffocating fog. A surge of anger pushes through the fear. He wants to fight back, to scream out, but he knows it's futile. The reality of the situation presses down on him. He is powerless. In this moment, everything he has believed about fairness, justice, and his place in this world shatters. As the officers shove him into the back of the van, one of them sneers down at him. "We don't play by your rules. You're nothing but a criminal to us." The words are harsh, brutal, an open declaration of the injustice that has already been decided for him. The officer's tone is filled with contempt, a reminder that to them the protagonist is less than human. The protagonist looks up at him, fury bubbling beneath the surface, but he doesn't speak. There's no point. This moment isn't about justice, it's about control. The clang of the prison door slamming shut echoes through the cold, sterile room, and the protagonist is shoved into a dimly lit cell. The air is thick with the scent of sweat and desperation, the walls peeling with age and neglect. As the door locks behind him, he takes a moment to breathe, his chest tight with the weight of his situation. He's no longer a free man, he's a prisoner, just another cog in a broken system. The flickering light overhead does little to calm his nerves. The silence is suffocating. In the corner of the cell, an older man sits, his face weathered and scarred by years of hardship. His eyes are sharp, but they carry the weight of experience, a man who's seen the worst this world has to offer. He looks up as the protagonist enters, studying him with a knowing gaze. The room feels heavy with unspoken truths, and for a moment the two men simply stare at each other. Then the older man speaks, his voice low but firm. The protagonist feels a mix of frustration and confusion. His mind races. He never imagined he would end up in a place like this. The walls feel like they're closing in, each tick of the clock a reminder that the system is designed to break him down. He's angry, but there's a deep, aching fear in him, too. Will he survive this, or will he become just another number, lost in the system? The older man's words are like a flicker of light in the darkness, offering something the protagonist hasn't felt since the arrest: hope. The realization that this isn't just about him, that there are others like him, fills him with a sense of camaraderie, but also a surge of rebellious energy. The older man leans forward slightly, his eyes filled with an intensity that commands attention. They want to break you down, make you forget you're a man, but you gotta fight. Don't let them win. His voice is gravelly but resolute, each word packed with the weight of years spent fighting against a system designed to crush people like them. There's no pity in his gaze, just a deep understanding of the struggle. The protagonist listens intently, absorbing every word. It's not just advice, it's a lifeline. For the first time since his arrest, he feels a glimmer of something he hasn't felt in a long time: strength. This man is not just a fellow prisoner, he is a mentor, a guide to navigating the broken system. The protagonist stands in the heart of his community, his back straight and shoulders squared, his voice carrying above the low hum of everyday life. He's no longer the fearful man who was arrested just days ago. He's a man transformed, driven by a new purpose. Around him, people go about their business, heads down, eyes averted, unwilling to challenge the status quo. But today, something is different. The protagonist walks to a small central square where a group of residents have gathered. He notices their wariness. Some hesitate, unsure if they should stop and listen. But he doesn't wait for permission. He steps forward, his voice rising as he calls out to them. The street corner becomes the stage for his newfound voice. The people are drawn in by his raw passion, the fire in his eyes, and his conviction. He speaks of the oppression, the fear, and the injustices that they've all suffered in silence. As he talks, his gestures become more animated, his hands slicing through the air, urging them to understand. There's a quiet intensity in the crowd as his words start to sink in. The protagonist is consumed with an overwhelming sense of urgency. He can feel the weight of their collective fear, the fear that has kept them in line, kept them from standing up. But there's no room for fear anymore. His voice is full of emotion, a mix of anger and hope, passion and pain. He knows this is the beginning of something much bigger than just his fight. This is about the future of everyone in his community, about breaking free from a system that has kept them all in chains. His words stir something deep within the crowd. The audience can feel the shift, the tension in the air, the stirring of dormant strength that begins to rise. The people listen, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all moved by the determination in his voice. The protagonist's voice shakes with raw emotion, his eyes locking onto the faces of those around him. They want us to hide in the shadows, but it's time to stand in the light. We have rights too. It's time we fight for them. If we don't, they'll keep us hidden, keep us silent forever. But not anymore. We have the power to make them listen. We are not criminals. We are not threats. We are human, and we have the right to live free. The crowd stirs. There are murmurs of agreement, some nodding their heads, others growing more animated. His words cut through the silence like a spark in dry grass, igniting something in the hearts of those who felt powerless for far too long. The streets are alive with energy, the air thick with anticipation. The protagonist stands at the front, his face set in determination. Behind him, a large group of protesters moves as one, a sea of people united by a single cause. They march with purpose, their footsteps in sync, their voices rising together in a unified chant. The streets, once a place of fear and silence, now echo with the power of resistance. The protagonist's eyes scan the crowd, seeing the faces of people who are ready to risk everything for their freedom. As they turn a corner, they come face to face with a line of armed police officers, standing firm and unwavering. The tension is immediate, like the stillness before a storm. The officers, clad in riot gear, hold their batons and shields tightly, their eyes cold and unfeeling. There's a stark contrast between the armed forces of oppression and the unarmed, determined people standing before them. The protagonist steps forward, his body language bold, but his heart pounding in his chest. He feels the weight of what's about to unfold, but he doesn't look back. His mission is clear, and he knows that this moment could change everything. The crowd falls into a tense silence, waiting for the first move. Fear and determination mix in the protagonist's chest. He's leading them all into a dangerous confrontation with the law, but he knows this is their moment. The protest is more than just about this fight. It's a symbol of resistance, of standing up against a system that has crushed them for too long. The air crackles with the uncertainty of what will happen next. The people around him are nervous but resolute. There is no turning back now. The protesters chant, their voices trembling with emotion, but growing louder with each passing second. The protagonist feels a surge of strength from the unity around him. This is the fight of their lives, and they won't back down. The protagonist raises his hand, silencing the crowd for a brief moment before speaking with a calm but unwavering voice. We won't stop until they hear us. We are not afraid. They want us to cower, to be invisible. But we will stand tall. We will make them see us. We will not leave these streets until they understand. We are here, we are human, and we will not be silenced. The words hang in the air, powerful and defiant, echoing off the buildings around them. The protesters respond with a renewed energy, their chants growing louder, bolder. We are not afraid. Their voices rise to a roar, shaking the very ground beneath them. It's a stand for their right. The protest reaches its crescendo. The chant of the crowd is deafening now, echoing through the streets, shaking the very foundations of the city. The protagonist stands at the front, his heart beating with the rhythm of the protesters' voices. He can feel the momentum. This is it, the turning point. The police line before him seems to waver, the tension palpable as both sides brace for what's coming next. Suddenly, a figure emerges from the crowd, a man the protagonist had seen many times before. He's been a quiet but steady presence in the protest, a face among the many. But now there's something different. The protagonist watches in horror as the man turns, slipping a phone out of his pocket, his eyes scanning the police officers in the distance. The protagonist's blood runs cold as he realizes what's happening. The man raises his phone to his ear, speaking in low tones, his words hidden beneath the roar of the crowd. The protagonist's eyes narrow, his stomach drops. This man, someone he trusted, someone who had been part of the community, is working with the enemy. He's a mole, a traitor. Shock and disbelief flood the protagonist's mind. His body feels like it's frozen in place, his thoughts racing a mile a minute. How could this happen? How could someone they had fought alongside, someone who knew the risks, turn their back on them? The anger quickly rises, hot and furious. It's a betrayal, not just of trust, but of the very fight they're all in. The unity that had once felt so strong now seems fragile, slipping through their fingers as the reality of the betrayal sinks in. The protagonist's fists clench, the anger in his chest boiling over. He can feel his pulse thudding in his temples, his vision narrowing as he walks toward the informant. The crowd starts to notice, murmurs spreading through the group. The tension becomes unbearable. The protagonist steps forward, his voice steady but laced with fury, his eyes burning with disbelief. You were with them all along? You betrayed us?" His voice cracks slightly, a mix of shock and raw emotion. The crowd falls silent, the realization dawning on them as well. They can feel the anger and pain in the protagonist's voice, and it reverberates through the air, a heavy silence hanging between them. The traitor stares back at him, his face unreadable. But the protagonist sees the fear in his eyes, the fear of being exposed. The crowd begins to murmur, confusion and anger spreading like wildfire. The betrayal has cut deep. The unity that once seemed unbreakable is now fractured, leaving everyone questioning who can be trusted. The streets are eerily quiet. The protests have simmered down into a tense silence, the only sound being the slow, heavy breathing of the crowd. The protagonist stands at the front once again, his posture firm, his eyes steely with resolve. He's not just standing before the police, he's standing for every person who has suffered under the oppressive system. The air is thick with anticipation. Every person in the crowd knows this is the defining moment, the last chance to make their voices heard. The line of police officers is now even more imposing, their weapons drawn, their shields held high. But this time, they don't intimidate the protagonist. He steps forward, every inch of him a symbol of defiance. His heart beats in his chest like a war drum. The police officers are just a few feet away now, and he knows that one wrong move, one spark, could turn the streets into chaos. But he doesn't flinch. Behind him, the crowd stands tall, their faces filled with hope, fear, and determination. They look to the protagonist for strength. They draw courage from him, ready to face whatever comes next. The tension is so thick, it feels suffocating, the quiet before the storm. Every eye is locked on the protagonist. This is it, the final test. Fear still lingers in the protagonist's heart, but it's no longer the paralyzing fear of before. It's a driving force, a fire that fuels his courage. He's not just fighting for himself anymore. He's fighting for the community, for every life that's been crushed by the system. The stakes are higher than ever, and his body trembles with the weight of what's at stake. But in the face of this overwhelming fear, he finds his resolve. The time for running is over. This is the moment that will define everything. The crowd watches him, waiting for a sign. The protagonist knows they are ready, but the question is he? His thoughts race, but he pushes them aside. This is his stand. He will not back down. The protagonist raises his hand to the crowd, signaling for them to be silent. His voice cuts through the heavy air, strong and unwavering, a beacon of defiance. We are not the criminals here. You can't silence our voices. You can't break us. This is our fight. For every person who's been unjustly punished, for every life stolen by hate, we stand together. We will not be afraid anymore. You can't stop us. You won't break us. We are here, and we will not be silenced any longer. His words are a battle cry, the culmination of everything he has fought for, everything he has endured. The crowd erupts, their voices joining his in a chorus of defiance. "We won't be silenced," they chant, their voices shaking the earth beneath them. The air is electric with tension. The protagonist's powerful words still echo in the crowd, and for a moment everything seems to hang in the balance. The police officers, armed and ready, tighten their grip on their shields, preparing to charge. The crowd stands firm, their eyes locked on the protagonist, waiting for his next move. The world seems to slow down, each heartbeat reverberating like a drum. It feels like time itself has frozen. Then, with a sudden sharp movement, the police begin to advance, their heavy boots stomping against the pavement, their shields clanking as they prepare to push through the protesters. The protagonist stands tall, unshaken, staring them down, ready for whatever comes next. But before anything can unfold, the screen suddenly cuts to black. The abruptness of the cut leaves the audience breathless, their hearts racing as they feel the weight of the moment. The uncertainty of what happens next lingers, creating a sense of both fear and hope. The silence after the cut is deafening, the anticipation so thick it could be cut with a knife. The cliffhanger leaves the audience teetering on the edge, hungry for more, desperate to know what will happen to the protagonist and the protesters. In that split second, emotions run high. The fear of the unknown, the hope of change, and the burning desire for justice all collide, leaving the audience anxious but energized. Just before the screen goes black, the protagonist's voice rings out one last time, his words filled with unwavering conviction. "This is just the beginning. We will fight for our freedom." His voice is full of determination, a promise that this fight is far from over. It's a statement of defiance and hope, and it leaves the audience with a sense of expectation. This is only the start.